So let's get into a little bit of a review when it comes to inequalities before we get into integers and how we solve for inequalities. So as we get into inequalities, just reviewing what it is that they're asking us to be able to do. They're asking us to be able to see an inequality and understand what it is that it's telling us, as well as be able to take a number line and graph it on a number line to indicate what the numbers can be. And when I say what the numbers can be, because these are going to be multiple possible answers. Remembering that inequality sounds like the two words any, A-N-Y, quality. I gave an example when we first were doing this about solving for an inequality because that's what we're going to be getting to once we get through integers, which is our next set of lessons. Then we're going to come back to this topic and we're going to be able to solve using all of our math functions, doing the opposite function on the opposite side, as well as using integers. So as we see this and we're solving for the variable of x, we see the greater than sign saying that x is greater than, but it also had that line underneath it. And that means it could be equal to the 5 or anything greater than. And therefore we have the dot, dot, dot at the end because we know it's any equality that is equal to 5 or more. Therefore numbers go on forever and ever and ever. So let's keep in mind when we're talking about inequalities, we are talking about seeing a comparison between a variable and a number, and that we're talking about greater than or less than signs. So just a quick review, greater than or less than. If you remember that the arrow always points to the smallest number, then you'll always know which side it is. In those two word examples of inequalities in the top right there, that would actually be saying that the first number is greater than the second number. The bottom one is saying that the first number is smaller than or less than the bigger number. But knowing that if it's pointing to the right or pointing to the left is the difference between greater than or less than is not what I need you to know. I need you to be able to look at the sign and be able to identify which side has to be smaller. And therefore, I always teach it as the arrow points to the smallest number. That way you know which way is smaller always and forever. So in this first example of an inequality, we have n is less than some number. So when we plot these, when we graph these on a number line, then we first have to circle the number, right? So keep in mind, remember, circling means it cannot be equal to whatever number is identified, right? That's why it's an open circle. Then I look at it and I'm asking, can it be less than? Has to be less than because the n is being pointed to. And since my variable is being pointed to, then I would shade my arrow to the left. When I look at the second one then, the number itself is being pointed to. So that has to be the smallest number. So I would identify where the number is on the number line and circle it because it cannot be equal to. And then seeing that the n is being pointed away from or on the bigger side of the arrowhead, then I know the n has to be the biggest number. Therefore, I shade to the right. Now, what we also saw was getting away from just greater than or less than is that they can also be equal to. So there are times that we have the greater than or less than signs and they're underlined. And that underline indicates that it can also be equal to a particular number. So when we look at that top one there, we see that n is less than or equal to a specific number. So we plot it by looking at the number itself. We circle it, but then since it can be equal to it, we have to fill in that circle. So we simply shade it in or we put a dot because we've plotted that it can be equal to a specific number. And then when we see that the n is being pointed to, it's smaller. So it can be that number or anything smaller than it or less than it. And in the fourth example, then going with the number being pointed to, it can be equal to that specific number because it is a filled in circle, right? And since it's underlined, I fill it in. But then the n is greater than. That's on the bigger side of the arrowhead. So therefore, I shade it in to the right. That's a quick review in about 4.5 minutes. All right, so now you have your handout that I want you to follow along and take some notes on. Make sure you're showing all the things that I'm showing, and therefore you can get full credit for showing your work, but also making sure that you have great examples for the backside. Remember, when we do the arrow, you can use your pencil to make the arrow thicker as long as I can tell that you have shaded it in and made it thicker. You can use a highlighter, you can use a marker, you can use the color pencils in the front of the room. It's up to you. Just whatever you use. If you do use a marker, make sure it's not going to bleed through your paper, because on the back side are the 14 questions that you're going to be doing for homework, and that assignment will be for a recorded grade. All right, so as we go through these, once again, we have a set of questions. And if you don't remember what the questions are, I would advise you to write them down at some point so that you can have those questions. I'll have them on all 6 of these examples. I don't expect you to have them written down as you're doing your work on the backside, but knowing what to ask yourself will help you be successful in doing inequalities. So the first thing I do is I mark where my inequality sign and my variable is. That's going to help me identify if I'm going to put a circle or a dot. It's also going to help me identify which way my arrow is going to go. So if you want to highlight it, circle it, put a box around it, that's up to you. Just be able to focus in on the variable and the inequality sign. What's left then is the number that I'm talking about. So I know I'm talking about the number 3. Now I have to ask myself, can it be 3? When I look at the inequality sign, I see it's underlined, so that is a yes. And since that is a yes, then I know I have to plot it. And once again, we say plot it because when we plot points on the XY axis, we put a dot. And that's what we have to put when it can be equal to it. So I'm going to put a dot, circle where the 3 is, and fill it all in. And then I go through my next question. Can it be less than 3? Well, the arrowhead is pointing to the 3, which has to be the smallest number, so that answer has to be a no. Therefore, my third question is, can it be more than 3? And that answer has to be yes, because the W is on the bigger side of the arrowhead. So since it's a yes, I know I'm going to draw an arrow going to the right. Once again, shade it in nice and thick so I can tell where it is. Highlight it or use a marker or a colored pencil, something that makes it stand out to where I know that you know which way the arrow goes. So when I look at just what is being plotted there, I can tell you that W can be equal to 3 and anything that's bigger than 3. All right, so when we look at number 2 then, same way we're going to start. Looking at the inequality, looking at the variable. I see that, oh, once again, I have a 3. So if it's going to be a 3, can it be equal to 3? Well, the inequality sign is underlined once again, so that has to be a yes. So I'm going to plot the 3. And once again, when we plot it, when it's a yes, it is a complete dot. I draw the circle and I fill it in. Now I ask, can it be less than 3? When I look at my variable, the arrow is pointing to the 3, so that has to be a yes as well. And if it is less than 3, then I know I have to draw my arrow to the left. Greater than, the arrow will always go to the right. Less than, the arrow will always go to the left. And remember, I don't have to ask the third question because I already have my arrow, so my first 2 are done. All right, so let's look at, so when I'm looking at just what is being plotted on the number line, then I would be able to identify that it's telling me that S can be 3 or anything smaller. And I put those extra sentences because on your iLearn, on your next NWEA, you might just be given the inequality number line with it all plotted with the arrow and the dot, and then you have to identify what the inequality would be when you write it out. All right, going through the inequalities for 3 and 4. Once again, we will start the same way every single time. We'll focus in on the inequality sign and the variable. And therefore, what is left alone is the number that we have to ask our first question for. Can it be equal to 2.5? Well, the inequality sign is not underlined, so therefore now we have a no. And once again, if it's a no, we're not going to plot it, we're simply going to circle it. So when I circle it, it says it cannot include this number, but I can either go greater than or less than everything else. When I look at the second question, can it be less than 2.5? Well, the inequality arrow is pointing at the 2.5, and that has to be the smallest number. The Q is on the larger side of the arrowhead, so that has to be bigger, so that has to be a no as well. Therefore, I have to use my third question. Can it be more than 2.5? That answer is a yes. And since it's a yes, I know I have to draw my arrow going to the right. So once again, if all I'm given is you need to use this variable and what is plotted on the number line create the inequality, then you should be able to look at it and say, well, I know that Q cannot be 2.5, but it can be anything bigger. So you should be able to go into reverse order and then create the inequality that you started with. When I look at question 4 and I focus in just on my variable and my inequality, then I'm left with a -2. So I ask my first question, can it be -2? Well, it's not underlined, so once again, that's a no. Therefore, I'm simply going to circle where the -2 is. Can it be less than -2? Well, when I look at my inequality sign, it's pointing to the -2, and therefore that has to be the smallest number, and that once again is going to be a no. Therefore, my third question, can it be more than -2? The z is on the larger side of the inequality arrow, so that has to be a yes. So therefore, I'm going to draw my arrow going to the right. Once again, if all I'm given is my variable and a plotted inequality on a number line, I have to be able to reverse engineer and come up with what that inequality has to be. So therefore, when I'm reading it, I can see that the variable z, well, it cannot be equal to -2, but the arrow tells me that it can be anything bigger than. So then I would be able to write my inequality that z is greater than -2. All right, our last two, and then I will wrap up the lesson. So on questions 5 and 6 on the front side of your worksheet, then we start by focusing in on the variable and the inequality. I have a 3 to ask my first question with. Can it be 3? Well, no, because it's not underlined, right? So since it's a no, then I'm going to circle where the 3 is. My second question is, can it be less than 3? Well, when I look at my inequality sign, it is pointing towards the W, so that has to be a yes. And since it can be less than 3, then I'm going to draw my arrow to the left. Once again, if all I'm given is a plotted inequality on a number line and a variable, I need to be able to go backwards. I need to reverse engineer it to come up with being able to write the inequality. I know you'll be asked to do this on future assignments, but also on your standardized testing. So therefore, we're reviewing it. So as I'm looking at what is being plotted, it says the inequality is that W cannot be equal to 3. However, it can be anything smaller than 3. Therefore, you should be able to write the inequality that it starts with the arrow pointing to the W and the 3 being the largest number. Our final review question, we have, as is stated, -1.5 is greater than Q. So I focus in on my variable and my inequality sign. I ask my first question with the number. Can it be -1.5? Well, that's a no. Once again, it's not underlined. Therefore, I'm simply going to circle where the -1.5 is. Now, don't forget that -1.5 has to be between -1 and -2. I have sixth graders every year that get confused by that, and they're used to a positive number, so they go to the right of the -1. Remember, you have a -1 and -2, so the -1.5 has to go in between them. Then I ask my second question, can it be less than -1.5? Well, let's see. The arrow is pointing towards the Q, so, well, that once again has to be a yes. And since it's a yes, I'm going to draw my arrow to the left. Once again, if all I'm given is this drawn inequality that's on the number line, and I'm told to use the variable Q, then I have to be able to read what it's telling me. And I know that Q cannot be equal to -1.5, but it can be anything smaller, and therefore I should be able to write the inequality out as -1.5 is greater than Q. All right, so that is our video. That's our lesson. So it's less than 15 minutes. Be sure to use this as many times as you need to review the process. I've gone ahead and included this math antics video that we started the lesson with. I'll try to use those more often. Some of you seem to enjoy those and be able to learn from this. So you have 14 questions to do. Once again, that is your assignment. So if you have any questions, please let us know, and we are there to help you. You have questions 7 through 20 on the backside.